Welcome to this trip through one of the most horrifying cases in history. We will look into a mystery that has lasted for generations and was purposely left out of the records of a whole family. If you're watching from a different part of the world, please tell us in the comments where you are right now. This video is not real. It was made up just for fun. Any similarities to real people, living or dead, are purely coincidental. In the remote mountains of eastern Kentucky, there was a community that lived by its own rules in the Appalachian forest, which looked like an unbreakable green blanket. We are talking about the late 1800s, when the law came too late or didn't come at all. The families who lived in those deep valleys kept secrets as deep as the roots of the redwoods that had been there for hundreds of years. Harlan County was known for being tough, for men who settled arguments without involving the police, and for women who learned from a young age not to talk about what they saw in their own homes. One of those women was Ruth Callahan. Her house was a dark wooden building that blended in with the trees around it. It was far away from the nearest village. The dirt road that led there was narrow, had a lot of dangerous turns, and was completely impassable in the winter. People who knew Ruth said she had a faraway look in her eyes, as if she were always watching something that no one else could see. She didn't go to the village very often, and she only bought the basics: flour, salt, and kerosene for the lamps. She only said what she had to say. She never smiled. The closest neighbors lived almost 3 kilometers away, and even they didn't know much about what happened on that remote property. Of course, there were rumors. In small towns, there are always rumors. They said Ruth had a past in another county and had left everything behind without saying why. People said behind her back that she wasn't the only one living in that house. There was someone there who was never seen, but no one dared to ask. Back then, in the Appalachians, getting involved in other people's business could be expensive. Something happened in 1891. Ruth stopped coming to the village. No one saw her for weeks. The owner of the general store saw that she wasn't there, but at first he didn't think much of it. After all, winter was coming, and a lot of families just stayed inside until spring. But when the snow melted and Ruth was still missing, questions started to happen. A farmer who lived nearby said he saw smoke coming from the chimney, which meant that someone was still there, but the house was still locked up, and the windows were covered with heavy curtains that never moved. The truth didn't come out of the shadows until a Methodist pastor made a routine visit. For a long time, he knocked on the door. He went around the house calling Ruth's name, but no one answered. That's when he saw something that made him uneasy. The back door was ajar that was moving a little in the wind. He went inside and called again, but no one answered. The house was clean, almost spotless. Everything seemed normal, except for the awful feeling that something terrible had happened there. The pastor came across a diary. It was on the kitchen table, open to a certain page, as if someone had put it there on purpose. The entries were short and written in shaky handwriting that got worse as the entries went on. Ruth wrote about the weight of silence, the secrets that can't be told, and the choices that stay with you. The last entry was written weeks ago. It just said that there was no place left to run. 2 men from Harlan County went to look into it. They broke into the house and looked through every room and closet. They found clothes, papers, and some money in a cookie tin. But Ruth Callahan was nowhere to be found, as if the thick woods around her house had eaten her up. There were no signs there was no violence, just absence, just the emptiness of someone who chose not to be there anymore. Investigators looked into Ruth's past. They found out that she had come to Harlan County a few years earlier from somewhere in Western Virginia, but there weren't many records, and they didn't all agree. No one knew for sure where she came from or why she chose to live in such a remote area. There were vague references to her family living in another state. But when they tried to get in touch, they found that no one wanted to talk about Ruth Callahan. Her name felt like a curse, something that had to be forgotten. And then came the discovery that would turn this case into one of the most mysterious in that area. Investigators found a bunch of letters in the basement of the house, hidden under some loose floorboards. There were dozens of them, all addressed to Ruth, and they were all written over the course of several years. There were letters from different places, but they all had the same message. Warnings for her, threats that weren't clear. To stay quiet, reminders that some secrets should never be told. Some people only signed with their initials. Some didn't even have a signature. Finding those letters completely changed the investigation. What looked like a simple disappearance now showed layers of secrets that someone had worked hard to keep hidden. The investigators figured out that Ruth's disappearance wasn't an accident. She had been running away from someone or something for a long time. One of the letters caught a lot of attention. It was from 1889 and talked about an event that supposedly happened on a farm near the border between Kentucky and Virginia. The writing was unclear and full of indirect references, but it was clear that Ruth had seen something she shouldn't have. "Silence protects us all, don't forget that," the letter said at the end. The county officials tried to follow these leads, but they only found closed doors. Nobody wanted to talk. Whole families said they didn't know Ruth or anything that had to do with her. It was like a secret plan had been made to hide any evidence of the truth. It looked like even official records had been changed or just vanished. The county offices no longer had the papers that should have been there. Ruth's house, on the other hand, stayed empty. People who lived nearby didn't go by at night. They said that through the windows they could see strange lights and shadows that moved for no reason. These stories may seem like myths, but they were based on real events. Real fear that the property caused. There had been an event there that no one wanted to remember. An interesting piece of information came from a lumber merchant who sometimes did business in the area. He said that months before Ruth went missing, he had seen a strange man hanging around the property. The man was not from the area. The way he talked and dressed made it clear. The stranger quickly walked away when the merchant tried to talk to him. He disappeared down the trail, going up to the mountains. No one else saw this man, and he was never found. Investigators started to think that Ruth might have been involved in something bigger, a network of events that crossed county lines. They found mentions of similar disappearances in old newspapers from other parts of Appalachia. Women who lived alone, disappeared without a trace, and whose cases were never fully looked into. There was a pattern there, something that no one wanted to look into, in all seriousness. Ruth had left clues, but they were all over the place, as if she knew she couldn't tell the whole story without putting more lives in danger. There were coded notes in the diary on the table. They were sequences of numbers that didn't make sense right away. Investigators tried to figure them out, but they couldn't. It was like Ruth had made up a special language to write down what she knew, keeping it safe even after she was gone. People in the area started to push for the case to be closed. They said it was a waste of time and that Ruth had probably just decided to move to a different place. Some people thought she might have gotten lost in the woods, which is a common thing that happens in that area. But the people looking into it couldn't believe these reasons. The way she had disappeared seemed too planned. Something that was planned. One of the letters found in the basement talked about a meeting that would happen in an old barn a few kilometers from Ruth's property. The text said that Ruth should go, but it would be risky. The letter didn't say why the meeting was happening or who would be there. The investigators found the barn that was mentioned. It was in bad shape because a fire had recently burned it down. No one in the area said they knew how the fire started. They found something disturbing in the rubble. There were marks on the dirt floor that looked like something heavy had been dragged. Investigators dug at the site and found personal items that had been buried. Things. a silver brooch, a pair of women's gloves, and a medallion with initials that didn't match Ruth's. These things made it seem like other people had been there, and that something had happened in that remote area, but it was impossible to put together a coherent story without bodies or witnesses. The Methodist minister who found Ruth's diary started his own search. He went to families in nearby counties and quietly asked them about women who had gone missing. What he found out was scary. There had been. There have been at least 5 other cases like this in the past 10 years. All of the women lived alone in remote areas and went missing without a trace. And in each case, the local police quickly closed the cases, saying there wasn't enough evidence. The Methodist pastor took what he had found back to Harlan County, hoping that the authorities would act quickly. But what he found was people who didn't want to help. The sheriff in the area made it clear that he didn't want to reopen old cases or look for connections that might not be there. His voice was cold. Words. An unspoken message that some questions shouldn't be asked. The pastor kept going, but he was politely told to focus on his religious duties and let the police handle the situation. The pastor got fed up and started writing down everything himself. He made a detailed record of each disappearance, including the dates and places where they happened and any other information he could find. His notes showed an interesting pattern in geography. All of the cases happened along an old trade route that crossed the mountains. This path had been used by travelers and merchants since before the war. A path that went over the mountains and was used by travelers and merchants before the war. There weren't many guards on the road, and there were a lot of places where someone could go missing without anyone noticing. Ruth wrote about this path in her diary. She wrote about how she used to watch people go by, especially in the fall when there were more of them. In an entry from October 1890, she wrote about a group of men who stopped near her property to rest. They started a campfire and stayed there for hours, talking in quiet tones. Ruth said that something about that scene made her uneasy, but she didn't say what it was. It started to become clear to the investigators that Ruth might have seen too much. Her house was in a good spot to look out over a long stretch of that old road. From her windows, anyone who walked by would be easy to see. If Ruth was keeping track of people's movements and writing down strange meetings and activities, she was an inconvenient witness for anyone who wanted to work behind the scenes. There were also the letters that threatened them. An analysis of the handwriting showed that they were from at least 3 different people. One had neat handwriting, which suggests they were well educated. Another one was rough and hard to read because the person who wrote it didn't do it often. The third had a strange style with over-the-top flourishes that made it look like they were trying to show off. It wasn't just one crazy person who wrote these letters. It was a network, a group that had planned to work together because they thought Ruth was a threat. During the investigation, an interesting detail came to light. Ruth had been to Pine Ridge, a village at the foot of the mountains, a few times. Every month, at the same time of year, she went there by herself. The innkeeper remembered her and said that Ruth would come at night and leave before dawn. She never said why she was coming and going, and no one ever saw her talk to anyone. She would just show up, stay for a few hours, and then leave again. The investigators went to Pine Ridge, hoping to find out what Ruth was up to there. There were only a few buildings along a main dirt road, so the area was small. The inn was still there, and the same man who had seen Ruth years before ran it. He took them to the room she used to rent, a simple space on the second floor with a view of the mountains in the distance. There was nothing special about that room that would make Ruth choose it. But then the innkeeper said something that caught my attention. He said that Ruth always wanted to stay in that room, never accepting another, and she would spend hours at the window watching the street below. He thought she was just enjoying the view, but now that he thinks about it, it seems like it had a different purpose. Ruth was looking. She was either waiting for someone or watching something that happened all the time on that street. When an old file was found in the county office next door, the investigation took on a more sinister tone. There was a report about strange things happening along that old trade route. The 1887 document talked about the disappearance of valuable cargo, or goods that just disappeared while they were being shipped. People thought that an organized group was stealing these shipments, but there was never enough proof to start a formal investigation. Ruth might have seen these things happen. Because she lived in a nice area and liked to watch and write down what she saw, she was in a dangerous situation. What if she had tried to do something with this information? What if she had said she would tell what she knew? This would make sense. The letters, the threats, and the fear that surrounded her name. The Methodist pastor found another important piece of information. He found notes left by a priest who had worked there decades earlier in a church that was no longer in use a few kilometers from Ruth's property. The priest wrote in his records that a number of women from the area had come to the church for safety, escaping what he called intolerable circumstances. The priest didn't go into detail, but he made it clear that these women were in real danger. The priest's notes showed something that no one had thought of before. Those women weren't just going missing, they were trying to get away. The abandoned church had been a stop for them, a place where they could get temporary help before moving on to places they didn't know. The priest said he would give supplies and show people safe routes, but his record stopped in 1888. There was no reason given for why he stopped writing, and there was no information about what happened to him after that. Ruth Callahan might have been one of those women who asked for help, or maybe she found this escape network and decided to write about it. There were vague mentions of safe paths and places to rest in her diary, but now they meant something else. She wasn't just watching the trade route, she was mapping out something much more complicated, a web of connections that someone wanted to keep secret. The investigators went back to Ruth's house with this new point of view. They looked more closely at each room to see if they could find anything might not have found in the first search. That's when they found a fake compartment behind a shelf in the pantry. There were more papers inside, like a basic hand-drawn map. The map showed the Appalachian region with special marks, like little symbols that pointed out different places along the mountains. Every symbol meant something. Some showed safe places, while others showed dangerous ones. Ruth had made a full navigation system for anyone who needed to cross that area without being seen. But why? Who would find this map useful? And more importantly, who would have a reason to keep this information from getting to the wrong people? The lumber merchant who had talked about the strange man got in touch with the police again. He thought of another detail that at first didn't seem important. The man had a heavy leather bag with him, the kind that is used to carry important papers. When the merchant tried to get closer, he saw that the man instinctively protected the bag, as if he were guarding something valuable or guilty. This information opened up a new line of inquiry. There might have been records somewhere if someone was moving documents through the area. Investigators called offices in other counties to ask about business deals, property transfers, and anything else that might seem strange. They were shocked by what they found. There were a number of land sales that didn't make any sense from an economic point of view. Intermediaries were always involved in the transfer of valuable properties for shockingly low prices, whose names came up a lot. Ruth had written some of these names in her diary. She didn't say who these people were, but she made it clear that they had some kind of power or authority. There was one name that showed up more than the others, and it was always next to a small symbol that looked like an upside-down cross. The investigators tried to find this person, but they found out that they had left the state years ago and hadn't left an address or phone number. The area started to change as the investigation went on. People who had been willing to talk before now shut their doors. People were getting more and more scared that getting involved in the case would have bad effects. The Methodist pastor got anonymous messages telling him to stop his research. He found notes on the church door that were short but clear warnings about how dangerous it is to be too curious. Still, he kept going. He thought there was something very wrong with that whole story, and he felt like it was his duty to find out what really happened. He started talking about justice and courage in his Sunday sermons, stressing how important it is not to let fear stop people from doing what is right. Some people in the community liked what he said, but others gave him dirty looks. One night, the pastor got an unexpected visitor. An old woman knocked on his door and stood there with dark shawls covering her face. She said she knew Ruth Callahan and that they had met a few times in Pine Ridge. The woman said that Ruth was involved in something dangerous, something that no official investigation could get to. She didn't want to go into detail, but she did say that Ruth had made brave choices that ended up hurting her. The woman left something with the pastor before she left. It was a small, old, and worn bronze key. She said the key would open something important, but she didn't say what. She only said that Ruth would want someone to find it, and that the truth should be known, even if it was too late to make a difference. Change. The investigators were very interested in this key. They tried it on all of Ruth's locks, but none of them worked. They tried it on chests, cupboards, and drawers, but it didn't work. It looked like the key had no use until someone said it might open something outside the property. Ruth might have hidden information in a place that only she knew about. Investigators had to look at all the places Ruth went again to find out where the key would fit. They went back to Pine Ridge and talked to She walked the paths she used to take and talked to the innkeeper. Nothing seemed to fit together. The key was still a mystery, a piece of metal that promised answers but didn't show where it led. The pastor saw something strange while looking for something. There was an old chapel on the road between Ruth's house and Pine Ridge. It was a small building that had been left empty for years. The building was still there, but no one used it for religious services anymore. Fighting time Because of the harsh mountain weather, the pastor chose to look into it, more driven by gut feeling than reason. The chapel was falling apart. The windows were broken. There were holes in the ceiling that let in light in uneven beams. There were wooden benches that were dusty and full of cobwebs. There was a small door at the back, behind what was left of the altar, that led to a storage area. A locked metal box was built into the stone wall. The key fit perfectly. There were papers inside the box that completely changed how people thought about the situation. Ruth wasn't just watching. She was actively recording an operation that involved a number of powerful people in the area. There were notes on meetings, descriptions of negotiations that happened behind closed doors, and notes on financial transactions that weren't recorded in any official books. Over the years, Ruth was putting together an archive of evidence, piece by piece. The papers showed that she wasn't doing the work by herself. There were mentions of other people who were only identified by their initials who were also gathering information. By initials who were also collecting information. There seemed to be a group of people who had decided to speak out about what they thought was a serious injustice. But the records stopped suddenly, which suggests that this network was found and broken up before it could do anything. One letter stood out to them. It was written in March 1891, just a few months before Ruth went missing. Someone told her in it that her identity had been stolen and that dangerous people knew who she was and what she was up to. The letter told Ruth to get rid of everything and leave right away. But the investigators could tell that Ruth had decided to hide the evidence instead of destroying it, and she stayed behind to make sure that no one could easily find it. This finding made the case even more tragic. Ruth knew she was in trouble. She had every reason to run away, but she chose to protect what she had collected. She took a chance that someone would eventually find those papers and finish the work she had started. It was an act of quiet bravery that doesn't get much attention because it happens out of sight of the world. The investigators brought the papers back to Harlan County, hoping that something would finally be done, but what they found was even more opposition. The sheriff wouldn't look at the papers because he said they were just personal notes that weren't worth anything in court. He thought that Ruth might have made everything up, and that she might be a troubled person who saw conspiracies where there weren't any exist. The message was clear. This case should be put behind us. The Methodist pastor didn't like that answer. He started making copies of the papers he found in the chapel and giving them to people he trusted. He wanted to make sure that the information would still be there even if something happened to the originals. This choice turned out to be smart because a few days later, a strange fire destroyed the chapel. Firefighters said it was an accident, likely caused by people who weren't paying attention. But the pastor was aware of it. There were no coincidences in this story. The people in the area were split. Some people backed the pastor's efforts, saying that the truth should come out no matter what. Some people said that bringing up old problems would only make things worse and that it was better to leave the past behind. This split caused problems that lasted for years, ruining relationships and making neighbors into strangers. They never found Ruth Callahan. There was no body, and no one saw what happened to her. She just disappeared from history, leaving a void that would never be filled. But the papers she left behind told the story of someone who was incredibly determined and chose to put the truth above her own safety. Years went by, and most people forgot about the case. New events took center stage, and new generations came along without knowing the details of that old mystery. Ruth's house eventually fell apart as time and nature took it back. Today, there are only a few foundation stones left to show where it used to be. The papers that Ruth had hidden began to circulate unexpectedly decades after she went missing. Families kept some of the copies that the Methodist pastor made as relics of a time that no one wanted to talk about openly. People who were interested in the unsolved mysteries of the Appalachian were drawn to these yellowed sheets with Ruth's careful handwriting. Historians in the area eventually learned about these papers. They tried to put the timeline back together by linking what Ruth said happened with official records from that time. What they found was very frustrating. A lot of the files that should have been there were just gone. There were gaps in the county records that didn't make sense. There were whole periods when it looked like important papers had been taken or never filed correctly. One researcher, who was very dedicated, spent years trying to find the people mentioned in Ruth's notes. Most of them had died a long time ago, taking their secrets with them. The children and grandchildren of these families didn't want to talk about it very much. Many people just said they didn't know anything about their ancestors or quickly changed the subject when asked about them. It was like a promise of silence had been passed down from one generation to the next. There were, though, some exceptions. An older woman agreed to talk as long as her name was kept secret. She said that her grandmother had known Ruth Callahan, and that the two of them had a secret friendship that no one else knew about, that they were friends in private, and that no one else knew about it. The grandmother is said to have said that Ruth was a person of strong morals who believed in justice, even when it put her own life in danger. The woman also said that her grandmother never told her what Ruth was looking into, only that it was something that could ruin whole reputations. This indirect witness made Ruth's story more relatable. She wasn't just a shadowy person, covered in mystery. She was a real person with beliefs and fears who had to make tough decisions when women didn't have many choices. It was already against social norms to live alone in the mountains. Few people would take the risk of writing down things that could involve powerful people. Researchers took a new look at the map in Ruth's house when they saw that some of the symbols matched up with places where other people had gone missing. Not only women. There were also men, such as itinerant workers who passed through the area but never made it to their destinations. merchants who vanished with their goods, travelers who were last seen going into certain areas on Ruth's map. This made it seem like the problem was much bigger than first thought. Ruth may have found a pattern of people going missing over the course of years, maybe even decades. And if she was right about what she saw, there was a group or organization in that area that did whatever they wanted without fear of getting caught. Sure that the mountains were too big and the authorities were too busy to look into what they were doing. A file that was found in a university library added another piece to that complicated puzzle. It was an article from a small periodical that came out in 1892 and was read in faraway counties. The article only briefly mentioned the case of a woman who went missing in Harlem. The tone was dismissive, implying that she probably left her property on her own. The article didn't say anything about of the threatening letters, the secret papers, or the investigations that had been done. It seemed like someone had tried to make the case seem less important on purpose. A lot of people did this kind of narrative manipulation back then. Local newspapers often relied on advertisers and powerful people to stay in business. It was dangerous to publish stories that might upset these people, so reporters often only gave brief accounts of problems or didn't cover them at all. Ruth may have known this and understood that it was possible. If she went missing, the people she was exposing would be safe from harm. Over the years, the property where Ruth lived was sold and changed hands many times. Every new owner heard stories about the woman who had gone missing there. But not many people believed these stories. They were just stories that people in that area tell about. Some people even thought it was romantic to picture Ruth as a mysterious person who chose to disappear to start a new life in a place far away. But those who looked into the people who read the documents probably knew that the truth was a lot less comforting. Ruth did not want to go away. She was put in that situation because she chose to face something too big for one person to handle. And the fact that she was never found suggests that those who wanted her to be quiet got what they wanted. The Methodist pastor who started the investigation never completely gave up on the Ruth Callahan case, even when the authorities didn't do anything, even when the community. Even though they pushed him to give up, he kept quietly gathering information. Years after he died, his personal notebooks showed that he was becoming more and more obsessed with the mystery. He had spent a lot of time trying to figure out what really happened in those mountains. The pastor wrote in his notes that he had started to see patterns in the stories he heard from older church members. Many people talked about strange things that had happened over the years, almost as if they were passing. People who asked for a place to stay. For one night, and then they were never seen again. People who came to do business and then left without doing any business. There were always good reasons for these absences. The person could have changed their mind, gone a different way, or found better chances somewhere else. But when the pastor started to map these events, he found that a lot of them happened near the old trade route that Ruth could see from her house. He also saw that the way people acted was strange. Some families in the area, some groups seemed to do well for no clear reason, getting land and resources without any clear way to make money. They traveled a lot, but they never talked about why they were going. When asked about their business, they either gave vague answers, changed the subject, or just didn't want to talk. The pastor started to think that these families were doing things they didn't want anyone to know about. Ruth had already named these same families in her papers. She wrote down names, described properties, and noted movements that she thought were strange. In a very revealing entry in her diary, she wrote about how she had started to notice groups of men meeting in remote places at night, after everyone else had gone to bed. They would talk in low voices and leave before dawn. Ruth couldn't hear what they were saying, but the fact that they were meeting in secret made her think that something was being planned that the law couldn't see. The pastor tried to figure out where these meetings will take place. He followed Ruth's clues, went to remote parts of the mountains, and looked for signs of people in places where they shouldn't be. He came across some interesting clues. There were clearings where the plants looked like they had been used a lot, as if people met there often. He found broken tools, pieces of rope, and campfire remains in some of these places. The campfires had been carefully put out, but they left marks on the ground. One of these spots was especially scary. It was at the bottom of a narrow valley with rocky walls that made it hard to get to. There was a building that was partially falling down there. It was probably an old hunting lodge that someone had turned into a place to meet. The pastor went inside this building and saw carvings on the wooden walls. There were initials, dates, and symbols that didn't make sense right away. Some of the initials matched names that Ruth had used in her papers. This discovery proved that Ruth was going in the right direction. She had found a real group of people who were working on something that needed to be kept secret at all costs. But what were they really doing? Ruth's papers made it look like she was doing illegal business, like smuggling or planned theft. But there were also vague mentions of other things that she couldn't or didn't want to explain clearly. It was like the story was so bad that she didn't even feel safe writing about it in her private notes. Totally. The pastor started talking to people in counties next to Harland, which made his investigation go beyond the limits of Harland. He found out that other parts of Appalachia had stories like his. Many people thought that some places were dangerous and that people should stay away from them, especially at night. When he asked why these places had this bad reputation, people didn't give him a straight answer. People said it had always been this way, that it was better not to ask questions, and that some things were safer when not paid attention to. This culture of silence was revealing in and of itself. It implied that numerous individuals were aware of or suspected something, yet had discerned that voicing their concerns was perilous. The pastor wrote in his notebooks about how this fear spread throughout whole communities. It wasn't a fear that was clear and open. It was something more subtle, a warning passed down through the years, an unspoken agreement that some lines should not be crossed. Ruth had crossed those lines. She had made up her mind that it was not okay to be quiet and that someone had to write down what was going on and then tell the world about it. Over the years, her writing showed that she was becoming more and more determined. The first few pages of her diary were full of doubts about whether she was getting things right. But as time went on, she became more sure of what she saw and more organized in how she wrote it down. Even if it meant living alone and always being in danger, she had found a purpose. The pastor also learned that Ruth had tried to get in touch with the police, not in the county. She had written letters to offices in bigger cities asking them to look into suspicious activities and giving them information about them. But it seems that these letters never led to any real action. They were either ignored or someone stopped them from getting to the people they were meant for. Ruth was up against a system that didn't want to be bothered and would rather keep up appearances of order, even if it meant ignoring clear wrongs. In her last diary entries, it was clear that Ruth was very upset. She wrote about how lonely she felt in this fight and how she wasn't sure if she was doing the right thing by not giving up. There were times when she felt like giving up and starting over somewhere else by destroying everything. But she always went back to the idea that someone had to do something, even if that person was just a lonely woman living in the mountains of Kentucky. The pastor felt a deep connection when he read these passages. With Ruth, he was also fighting against indifference, trying to get people to see a truth that they would rather not see. His sermons started to show these thoughts. He talked about having moral courage, the duty not to ignore wrongs, and how not saying anything can be just as bad as doing something wrong. Some people agreed with what he said, but others who wanted to forget the past got even more upset. When the pastor decided to hold a public meeting to talk about Ruth, things in the community got very tense. The case of Callahan. He wanted to make a place where people could talk about things without being afraid, where stories that had been kept quiet for years could finally be heard. He told everyone about the meeting weeks in advance, hoping that the news would spread and bring in people who were willing to talk. The answer was mixed. Some people were really interested and said it was about time someone finally solved those old mysteries. Others were angry and said the pastor was, making things worse by reopening wounds that had already healed. Some people even said he should be fired because what he was doing was hurting the community's peace. The church was full on the night of the meeting. People came from nearby counties, some out of curiosity and others because they had their own stories to tell. The pastor started by talking about how he got involved in the case and what he had learned so far. Years. He talked about Ruth with respect, not as a mysterious person, but as someone who had tried to make things better in a bad situation. After that, he let people speak. There was a long, awkward silence. It didn't seem like anyone wanted to be the first to speak. The pastor waited patiently because he knew that it wasn't easy to break years of silence. At last, an old man stood up. He said that his father had met Ruth and that she had come to see his family a few times. His dad always talked about. He told her how much he admired her and how brave she was, but he never said why. This first testimony let a lot of other people talk. People started to share bits of information, like pieces of a huge puzzle. One woman said that her aunt had worked at the Pinneridge Inn for a short time, and that she remembered Ruth as a quiet but strong presence. Another man talked about how his grandfather used to stay away from certain mountain trails because he thought bad things happened there, but no one else did. Real information. It was all second-hand or third-hand memory, bits of conversations heard as a child, and vague memories passed down through the years. The pastor knew that even with all the good intentions in the room, the whole truth about Ruth Callahan would still be out of reach. It had been too long. There were too many dead witnesses. Important papers were gone. The meeting, however, was very important. It made sure that Ruth would not be forgotten and that her story was worth telling, remembered, even if they never really understood it. The pastor suggested putting up a small memorial plaque at the site of Ruth's old house. It would be simple and say that she had lived there and that her fate was still unknown. Some people voted against the proposal, but it was still approved. The pastor kept doing research in the months that followed, but he changed what he was looking into. He stopped trying to figure out the mystery and started writing down the bigger picture. He desired to understand what life was like in those mountains at the end of the 1800s, what problems people had to deal with, and how they handled conflict and unfairness. This method showed a lot about why Ruth's case was so easy to miss. At that time, the Appalachian region was mostly self-governing. Federal law was more of a suggestion than a rule. Local communities made their own rules, settled disagreements without going to court, and rarely called in outside help. This independence had its pros, making a strong feeling of belonging, but it also let people abuse their power and do things without being watched. Ruth lived in this world. She couldn't just go to the police or the courts and expect them to do something right away. The community would have to change on its own, either through social pressure or by making the problem she had found public. But she needed help from other people, and it seems that Ruth didn't get enough allies before things got too bad for her. The pastor started to see Ruth not as a lone hero, but as someone who tried to make a broken system work. She made the most of what she had. She carefully wrote down everything, cleverly hid evidence, and tried to build a case that someone could use later. Even though this didn't lead to immediate justice, it doesn't make her work any less valuable. The pastor was very sad about this point of view. He knew he was up against the same problems that Ruth had dealt with years ago. Before, there was institutional resistance, fear in the community, and a desire to keep up appearances instead of facing uncomfortable truths. It was like history was repeating itself, showing that some fights are never really over, only put on hold for a while. He also started to see why Ruth's families had removed her name from their records. It wasn't always because they were involved in what she was looking into. It was probably shame or fear of being connected. When reputation was everything, having a relative who was involved in a scandal, even as a witness or researcher, could hurt the family's reputation. So, it was easier to act like Ruth never existed, take down pictures, burn letters, and tell future generations not to talk about her. More people than you might think did this. They erased bad people from family records. While doing research, the pastor found other examples. There were families that never talked about certain relatives who skipped names in family trees and didn't say anything when these people were talked about. Ruth was one of many people who had been purposely forgotten. But Ruth had left behind a file, which was different from the others. Her papers survived because she hid them well. The pastor cared enough to keep them safe. And now, decades after she went missing, her voice could still be heard through those yellowed pages. She had found a way to get past the silence they were trying to force on her. Over time, Ruth Callahan's case changed into something else than it was at first. What started out as an investigation into a certain disappearance turned into a deeper look at how stories are told and then forgotten. The Methodist pastor, who was now old and tired from fighting alone, started to think that maybe Ruth's real legacy wasn't solving her mystery, but instead the questions she made people ask about their own communities. He got letters from historians and researchers who were interested in the case. Some came from faraway universities because they wanted to look at Ruth's papers as part of school projects on the history of Appalachia. The pastor didn't know whether or not to share this information. He wanted more people to hear Ruth's story, on the other hand. He was afraid that distant academics would turn it into just another case study, taking away the humanity he had worked so hard to keep. He finally decided to give copies of the documents to a university library, but only if they were treated with care and not published. Recognize Ruth as a real person, not just someone from history who is interesting. The library agreed, and the papers were sorted and made available for research. This brought the case back into the public eye, but most of the interest was shallow and focused on the mysterious part instead of the deeper questions Ruth was trying to answer. One very dedicated researcher spent months looking through the papers. He saw something that other people had missed. Ruth's handwriting changed over the years. At first, the writing was firm and sure, but as time went on, it got more and more uneven, with strokes that made it look like the writer was in a hurry or tense. Some parts of the last pages were almost impossible to read, as if she were writing under a lot of stress, maybe in low light, or afraid of being caught while writing. This observation gave us a new way of looking at how Ruth spent her last few months. She knew for sure that time was running out, that her actions had been found out, and that there would be consequences. But instead of running away or destroying the evidence, she sped up her work, trying to record as much as she could before it was too late. Her actions showed not only bravery but also a strong belief that what she was doing would have lasting value. The researcher also saw that some pages were missing from the diary. There were spaces where pages were clearly missing. They had been carefully torn out so that the pages next to them wouldn't get damaged. We couldn't tell if Ruth took these pages out herself or if someone else did. Them later. But the story had frustrating holes in it because these parts were missing. There were times when Ruth's story jumped from one point to another without any transition. These holes made people guess. Some people thought that the pages that were taken out had information that was so dangerous that it would still be hard to share it today. Some people thought that Ruth had taken out certain parts to keep innocent people who might be involved safe. There was also the idea that the pages never existed, that Ruth on purpose left blank spaces to make it look like she knew things she didn't, as a way to protect herself by not knowing. Finally, the memorial plaque was put up where Ruth's old house used to be. It was a simple bronze plaque with only a few lines of text that said Ruth Callahan lived there in the late 1800s and that no one knew what happened to her. There weren't many people at the unveiling ceremony, but it was very important symbolically. It was an official confirmation that Ruth had, that she had lived, and that her story should be told. During the ceremony, the pastor spoke for a short time. He said that Ruth stood for all the people whose stories have been lost, erased, or forgotten, or who tried to make a difference but were silenced by time or stronger forces. He didn't talk about theories about what happened to her, or make any guesses about crimes or conspiracies. He just remembered her and accepted that some questions would never have good answers. After that, people who were interested in historical mysteries started to pay attention to the area around Ruth's old property. People would come by from time to time, take pictures of the plaque, and walk around the grounds, thinking about what it must have been like to live there. Some people left flowers, while others stacked small stones to make temporary memorials. Ruth had become something of a local legend, even though not many people knew the whole story. The pastor often thought about what he had learned through his work in his later years. Investigation. He understood that his quest for the truth about Ruth had changed him in a big way. At first, he just wanted to solve a mystery, but in the end, he learned a lot more about memory, justice, and how fragile historical truths are. Ruth had been his teacher for decades, teaching him about honesty and never giving up. He also said that he would never be sure what really happened to Ruth. He could guess. He could come up with theories based on incomplete evidence, but he could never find the whole truth. Proof, but he couldn't get to the whole truth. And maybe that was the right thing to do. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. They're meant to show us how little we know and how time can make even the most important events seem less important. The pastor's last notes on the case said that the real story of Ruth Callahan was not about her going missing, but about her fight. She had refused to accept unfairness, had written down what she saw even when it put her in danger, and had kept her findings safe so that future generations could learn from them. The pastor said that what really mattered was not where she went or how her life ended, but how she chose to live it while she could. This way of thinking brought peace to both the pastor and the people who had been involved in Ruth's story. It wasn't the end that everyone wanted. There weren't any big surprises or late justice, but there was recognition. There was a memory. There was respect. And for someone who had been intentionally erased from that was already a win in the records. The next few decades saw big changes in the Appalachian region where Ruth had lived. Paved roads took the place of old trails. People in isolated communities were able to use modern technology, and the long-standing culture of silence started to fade away. But Ruth Callahan's case was still an open wound in everyone's minds, something that has never been fully dealt with or understood. New generations found out about the story in ways that surprised them. Nearby, the history professor started using the case as an example in his classes to show how a lack of good records can make it hard to understand what happened in the past. The story interested his students so much that they asked questions that the professor couldn't fully answer. This made some of them do their own research by going to archives, talking to people who had lived there for a long time, and looking for clues that other people had missed. One of these students, who was very determined, chose to write her university thesis on Ruth Callahan. She spent years reading through the available documents, learning how to read Ruth's strange handwriting, and trying to figure out the coded references that were still a mystery. The student came up with the idea that Ruth wasn't working alone. At least 2 or 3 other people were helping her, sharing information, and protecting her when she needed it. This theory was based on patterns that were found in Ruth's letters. She wrote letters where she talked about getting warnings about strange behavior that she couldn't have found out about on her own because she lived in a remote area. Someone was watching her and telling her what was going on. Some of the choices Ruth made, like hiding documents in the faraway chapel, showed that she knew about safe places that she probably wouldn't have found on her own. The student tried to find these potential partners, but they ran into the same problems that the pastor had decades before. There were missing records, witnesses had died, and families wouldn't talk. But she found out something interesting. There were records in the church archives of a small group of women who met regularly for Bible studies around the same time that Ruth was active. This group stopped meeting all of a sudden in 1891, the same year that Ruth went missing. Could it just be a coincidence? The student didn't agree. She thought that this Bible study group was really a front for meetings where these women talked about more serious things and shared their worries about what they saw in their neighborhoods and maybe even thought of ways to record or bring attention to issues. Ruth may have been a member of this group or had ties to it. There was no way to prove this theory for sure, but it gave a new way of looking at Ruth's story. She may not have been completely alone. She may have been part of an informal group of women who were trying to change a society that didn't give them much official power. This made her story even more important, as it hinted that there were more people, silently fighting against wrongs that history books will never record. The student's thesis was published and got some academic attention. It sparked new interest in the Ruth Callahan case, which led to new investigations and analyses. An independent filmmaker even thought about making a movie about the story, but they gave up because they thought there were too many holes in the story and it would be impossible to tell it well without filling those holes with too much information. Guessing. But the attention from academics also led to criticism. Some historians said that Ruth was being romanticized and changed into something she might not have wanted to be. They said that her papers were mostly subjective observations that didn't have any outside proof. Maybe Ruth was just a lonely person who saw patterns where there weren't any, and made up stories out of coincidences and misunderstandings. This doubt was reasonable to some degree. Ruth's story was made up of bits and pieces, interpretations, and guesses that filled in the blanks. Decades later, there was no way to check many of her claims, but people who looked closely at her papers tended to think that there was real substance behind what she said. The way her notes stayed the same over the years, the specific details she wrote down, and the way she organized her findings. All of this made it seem like someone was doing a real investigation, not making up stories. The discussion about Ruth's credibility brought up bigger questions about how we judge historical accounts, especially those from people who were not given a chance to speak up. How much doubt is good, and how much doubt becomes a way to silence people who were already ignored in life. There were no clear answers, and people who studied Ruth's case still disagreed. In the meantime, people still came to visit the property where Ruth lived from time to time. Some came from a real interest in history. Some were just interested because they had heard stories about mysteries. Over the years, the memorial plaque had to be replaced a few times because it had been vandalized for reasons that no one could fully explain. It was put back on each time, showing how determined some people were to keep Ruth's memory alive. Eventually, a group of local activists suggested turning the site into a smaller, more detailed memorial, maybe a garden with informational panels that tell Ruth's story and talk about the bigger picture. Historical background. There was a lot of disagreement in the community about the proposal. Some people were very supportive of it because they saw it as a way to honor not just Ruth, but all the women whose stories had been lost. Some people were against it because they thought it was giving too much importance to a case that was never solved and could be based on misunderstandings. In the end, the proposal was turned down because there wasn't enough money or community support. But the talk itself was useful. It made the community face its own past, to recognize how some stories had been hidden, and to ask why people were still so resistant to looking at the past. The Methodist pastor would have liked these conversations, even though they were hard to have. Over time, the story of Ruth Callahan began to change in the minds of many people. She became a symbol of resistance for some people against systems that were unfair. For some, she stood for the risks of going against power structures that have been around for a long time. Some people saw her as a tragic figure, someone whose good intentions were ruined by the impossible situation she was in. The university library that had Ruth's papers started to digitize them so that researchers all over the country could access them. This gave the case a new point of view. People with different academic backgrounds looked at the material and each found something interesting about it. Sociologists looked into the community dynamics elucidated in Ruth's notes. Anthropologists looked at the cultural practices that were talked about. Linguists looked at the patterns in the writing and the words that were used. A forensic psychologist gave a very interesting explanation. He said that Ruth's last diary entries made it seem like someone was planning to disappear on purpose. The way she arranged her papers, the choices she made about what to keep secret and where, and the mysterious last entry could all be signs that Ruth was planning to leave. She may not have been forced to disappear, but she chose to do so because she knew that staying would put her in danger. This interpretation provided a more agency-oriented perspective on Ruth's narrative rather than portraying her as a passive victim of circumstances. She would have been someone who took charge of her situation by choosing when and how to leave the scene. There was no way to prove or disprove this theory, but some people liked the idea of Ruth as having had at least some control over her final fate. Other scholars strongly disagreed with this way of looking at things. They said that making Ruth's disappearance seem like a strong choice ignored the real danger she was in and downplayed the violence in the letters she got. These critics thought it was important to keep the story's tension high, to admit that Ruth probably didn't have any good choices, and to say that any choice she made was made under a lot of pressure. These scholarly discussions occasionally appeared, not connected to the real-life events in Ruth's story. She was a real person with real hopes and fears, not just a theoretical person to be studied in college classes. But these talks also kept her memory alive by making sure that new generations kept thinking about the problems she had brought up. The Appalachian region kept changing. Families that had been there for a long time left. People who didn't know the history of the area came. People stopped using the old trade route that Ruth used to see in favor of. More modern roads that went in different directions. The geographical landmarks she wrote about slowly went away. They cut down trees in the forests. Land was built up. The landscape changed so much that Ruth would hardly recognize it. But some places still looked pretty much the same. One of them was the valley where the pastor found the empty building with writing on the walls. Environmentalists had been able to save this area by making it a nature reserve. This meant that one of the places where Ruth was looking for people to meet was now protected, which is funny. A historical fiction writer became interested in the case and started writing a book loosely based on Ruth's story, even though her own home had completely disappeared. He was very creative, making up dialogue, dramatic scenes, and filling in the gaps in the story with his own imagination. The end result was a story that grabbed the attention of a lot of people, even people who didn't know it was happening. The academic groups that had been studying Ruth for years. But the book also caused a lot of trouble. People who were related to the families mentioned in Ruth's papers were very angry with the book because they thought it slandered their ancestors without any proof. They threatened to sue, asked for retractions, and said it was very disrespectful to turn real tragedies into entertainment. The writer defended his work as clearly fiction, but it hurt his reputation a lot. This incident showed that even more than AAA, Ruth's case still made people feel very strongly about it 100 years later. The wounds she had touched were still not healed. Some people still wanted the whole story to be forgotten, and they thought that any talk about it was a personal attack on their families. Ruth's original documents got a lot of attention again because of the controversy over the novel. Investigative reporters started looking into them again, this time to see if they were linked to well-known families of the time. Some of the descendants. Some of the people Ruth talked about were now politicians or successful business people. They couldn't stand the idea that their ancestors might have done things that weren't right. The university library was told to take Ruth's papers out of the public eye. Lawyers said that the notes were still defamatory after all this time because they were concerned about privacy. The library fought back, saying that the material was important to history, but they had to put more limits on how the people could use documents in their writing. This modern legal fight was similar to the power struggles that Ruth had to deal with in her life. People with money and connections trying to control stories, silence voices that are inconvenient, and protect reputations even if it means lying about history. Scholars of the case did not miss the irony. Ruth was still fighting the same battles decades after she died. In the end, the case came to a compromise. The documents would still be available, but with a lot of warnings about the historical background and the problems with primary documents that haven't been verified. Researchers would have to sign contracts promising to use the material in a responsible way. It wasn't perfect, but it kept academic access and offered some protection against bad use. While these legal battles were going on, a group of amateur archaeologists got permission to dig up the site of Ruth's old house. They wanted to find things that could give them information about her daily life, maybe even hints about her missing. They worked carefully for weeks, going through the dirt and making a list of each piece they found. Archaeologists found pieces of pottery, rusty tools, and parts of a foundation that proved where the house used to be. But nothing gave away big secrets or gave clear answers about what happened to Ruth. It was just proof that someone had lived there, that they had been there and then left, leaving behind only physical traces that time had almost completely erased. This might be the most honest thing that can be said about Ruth Callahan's story. There are no shocking truths to be found, and no complex plots to be revealed. There is only one woman who lived in a hard time, made brave choices within the limits of her situation, and then disappeared in a way that will never be fully understood. What we have left are the questions she makes us ask, not the answer to what happened to Ruth. How do we treat people? Who go against the rules? Which stories do we want to keep and which do we want to let fade away? How do we find a balance between wanting to know the truth and respecting the fact that every human story is complicated and unclear? The memorial plaque at the site of her old property is still there, despite the weather and time. Every now and then people come by, take pictures, and stand quietly for a few moments, thinking about the woman who used to live there. There are no answers waiting for them there, just the chance to think about how stories are lost and sometimes, against all odds, partly found again. The Appalachian Mountains keep rising against the horizon, not caring about the human dramas that played out in their shadows. The forest is growing where Ruth's house used to be, and the roots of the trees are entwined with the soil she used to walk on. Nature has taken back that space and made it part of the wild landscape that has always been there. And maybe it makes sense that Ruth lived on a line between civilization and wilderness, order and chaos, voice and silence. Her final resting place is unknown, and her story is still not finished. These are the same conditions that she lived in. She lived on the edges, and her memory still lives on the edges, never fully revealed or fully forgotten. People who study her case see Ruth as more than just a historical figure. She stands for all the stories and voices that have been silenced, that have been forgotten, all the brave things that have happened that aren't in the official records. Her legacy is not in the answers she gave, but in the questions she keeps asking people of all ages. The papers she left behind are still in the archives. They are yellowed pages with her handwriting getting worse and worse, showing how determined she was under increasing stress. Researchers in the future will keep finding them, looking at them through the eyes of their own time and giving them new meanings that Ruth may not have thought of. Her story will change, grow, and be told again and again in ways that show what each new generation cares about. That also seems right. Stories don't stay the same. They live on in the stories people tell about them, the memories they leave behind, and the lessons they teach or warn people about. Ruth Callahan may have physically vanished over a century ago, yet her influence endures through the waves she generated, the inquiries she provoked, and the bravery she exhibited. We will never get to know her. Final outcome. We will never know for sure what she was looking into or why she was taken out of family records. These mysteries will stay unsolved, which will make people who want clear answers and closure angry. But maybe the real value of her story isn't in the ending, but in the process of trying to understand, in remembering, and in not letting her be completely forgotten. Mountains are good at keeping secrets. The Appalachians' deep valleys and thick forests have seen many human stories that have been told over the years, most of which are now lost forever in the silence of time. Ruth Callahan is one of the few people who left behind enough evidence for us to get a sense, even if it's not perfect, of who she was and what she wanted to do. And so her story doesn't end with answers, it ends with the memory of her. A name on a bronze plaque, papers in university archives, academic arguments, and some guessing. It's a small kind of immortality, but it's more than most of us will leave behind. Ruth Callahan has not been, not remembered. And her story will keep being told as long as there are people who are willing to ask questions about the past, look for uncomfortable truths, and speak up for those who can't. If this trip through the secrets of the past has inspired you, think about subscribing to the channel. There are so many stories to tell and so many questions that need to be answered in the past. Leave a comment with your thoughts, and we'll see you next time.